Last time, we covered the Venusaur line, and now, I've immediately got the next Pokemon I want to talk about, Flareon. Now, if you missed the Venusaur video a few weeks back, then all you need to know is I've started a series where I choose a Pokemon I feel like talking about, and just, well, talk about it. It was originally going to be more of a facts and trivia sort of thing, but we've all seen that sort of thing before, and the Gen 1 Pokemon are especially well documented. So I'm kind of just going to give my opinion off the cuff, and I feel like I have something to say about Flareon. But first, Luna's World. If you like lo-fi music and want to relax for a bit, Luna's World is the place for you. Anywho, let's get started. So, with the last video being Venusaur, it was a pretty positive one all around. Nostalgia, gameplay, all that good stuff. But I felt like doing an Eeveelution this time, and not all of them are exactly balanced well. Some are very strong, and others have some really strange design decisions. And the most infamous of those is Flareon, one of the 3 original Eeveelution options. So first, let me be clear. I love Flareon. Like a lot. That's why I'm doing a video on it. Let me repeat. I love Flareon. It's an Eeveelution. And I love all my Eeveelutions. But if your first introduction to it was red, blue, and yellow, something about it was always kind of off. Especially if you had experience with Jolteon and Vaporeon. Jolteon is fragile, but insanely fast, and can hit with reliable electric attacks like Thunderbolt very hard, very consistently. Vaporeon is slow, but it has insanely high HP and good special defense, and it hits just as hard and reliably as Jolteon with special hits. Then, there's their good typings. Well, good for the most part. But with Flareon, it has the low HP and low physical defense of Jolteon, and the low speed of Vaporeon. You hear that, and you'd think that it must be the tank of the trio or something. But its physical defense is horrible, even lower than its base speed. And let's forget about competitive rankings or whatever. Just think about that low defense in a regular playthrough in red, blue, and yellow. Do you realize how many physical attackers you're getting hit by as you're marathoning through trainers in that game? Oh, and that sweet base 110 special stat? Well, when it gets split in Gen 2, that special attack is going down to 95. All 3 of them got a minor stat nerf with the balance changes in Gen 2. And while this isn't a huge deal in the end, it's still worth pointing out that, stat-wise, it's actually worse after Gen 1. That leaves it with a 130 physical attack stat that it can't even do anything interesting with because fire attacks are universally special until Gen 4. This is phenomenal for Flareon, right? No. It couldn't even learn Flare Blitz. It literally has Flare in its name, and it couldn't even learn the move until Gen 6. That is just insanity to me. I don't get it. Now, unfortunately, I'm not talking about the tragedy of this Pokemon's first impression. One of the other biggest issues it had in its debut was its typing. A lot of players back in the day probably saw a fire and an electric option and thought, cool, I'm gonna pick one of these two. Because, really, it's probably clear to any player that's paid attention up to this point where you've gotten an Eevee, that you realize that there are way more water Pokemon available than electric and fire, especially fire. And that made Flareon a very appealing choice for those who didn't choose Charmander or really wanted another fire type because they seemed rare. Sadly, the fire typing just ends up not being very good in Gen 1. These days, it's considered an excellent typing, but it took quite a few generations for it to get to that point. Strong fire moves aren't terribly accessible, especially in the early game. And in general, there weren't really any optimized fire types yet compared to Psychic, Normal, and even Ground types. Those good attacking stats only get it so far, with its terrible move pool, very low speed, and inability to take many hits. To really hammer this in, it's infamously poor in the competitive scene. But let's take another Pokemon that's currently listed in ZU to compare. Sandslash. Sandslash, despite that tier placing, is still kind of a good Pokemon in Gen 1. It's way better in Gens 2 through 5, of course, but it has a better typing for red, blue, and yellow, and it has access to a fantastic stab Earthquake. And this is supposed to be more of a beginner-friendly evolution compared to Flareon, as Sandslash is available early in most games it's in, and evolves pretty quick too. It's almost like a ground-type Raichu for your in-game playthrough, and it's a really underrated choice for your team, which is something I wouldn't say about Flareon. Now, I've been real negative so far, but I'm just spitting facts. I must remind you, I like Flareon. And it's the fact that I like this Pokemon that lets me fully realize the tragic nature of it. Think about it. This Pokemon's visual designs is the one that feels the most natural as an evolution for Eevee, as it looks like a more mature, larger version of it. Like, it legit looks like the most petable and huggable of them all. And yet, during the height of Pokemania, it wasn't actually very fun to use at all, and would become a punching bag for mockery on Pokemon forums for years. I remember seeing posts on forums even mocking the idea of Game Freak trying to improve it. I'm talking like Gen 4 and Gen 5 era. It was so cool to hate on Pokemon like Flareon that some were even against the concept of giving it Flare Blitz, which honestly is a pretty stupid thing to say. Not only because the move made it more fun to use in single player runs when Flareon finally got in, but also because it's fun to try to come up with strategies to win against your opponents online with a Pokemon you like, even when it's not exactly an optimal choice. Some people are just no fun, man. That's not to say you'll never see Flareon outside of a casual playthrough, or some Flareon superfan that needs it in their party. It's far from the worst Pokemon ever. It has enough stats overall to achieve a basic standard of filling some kind of role in your party, and thanks to things like the tiering of Smogon formats, there are some gens where Flareon is actually pretty decent in the tier it's placed in. So even there you'll find a use for it. And because of that, I think it deserves at least a little bit of respect. Try using it in the GSC and RSE and U tiers if you're into competing in older gens. It is actually pretty good there. Let's wrap this up by doing a bit of a follow-up to what I did in my Venusaur video, where I talked about how strange the lore of its evolution was in the early episodes of the anime. As you would expect, there's an episode that features Eevee, the 40th episode I believe. There are these three Eevee brothers in the episode that really hype up their evolutions, that being the only three available at the time: Jolteon, Vaporeon, and Flareon. The scene saves Flareon for last, and it's very funny to hear its trainer proudly boast that it's the strongest evolutionary choice of all. And he says it pretty matter-of-factly. I can only imagine this scene leaving an impression on some kid in 1999 that's finally going to play Pokemon Blue, choosing Flareon because of how cool it looked, only to be frustrated with how unreliable it could be compared to the other Pokemon. Then, that same kid probably thinking his Haunter is going to be effective against Sabrina's psychic types because of another anime episode. Yeah, I remember the anime used to mess with us a lot, and it was pretty fun. Good times. And well, I think this is a good time to stop with the subject of Flareon before moving on to the next Pokemon I feel like talking about. I think it's a great example of using a Pokemon specifically because you really like it, and not because it's immediately powerful or anything like that, which is a large part about what the series is about, isn't it? Maybe I'll make a team around it someday for one of the earlier gens to see how it works and share it with you guys. But what do you guys think of Flareon? Surely there has to be some fellow fans out there. What's your best experience ever using it? Let me know in the comments below. And with that said, I'll see you guys real soon.